evening, good morning. I think for most of you it's good evening because you're joining us here from Johannesburg. Welcome to our TEDxJohannesburg fireside chat with Juan Enriquez. Welcome to TEDxJohannesburg, Mr. Juan Enriquez. Juan is a leading authority on the economic impact of life sciences. I think most of you would be familiar with his work. He's an all-star TED speaker with 9 TED Talks, if I'm right, and a dozen TEDx talks. He is a co-author of several books, including As the Future Catches You, The United States of America, Evolving Ourselves, and his latest book, Right, Wrong, How Technology Transforms Our Ethics. And today's conversation is really about the latest book. Juan, thank you for making the time. I'm hoping some of you were able to get copies of the book. Unfortunately, I think for most of us, it's online. But I'm sure we'll have a good conversation. Juan, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be traveling virtually today. I'm in a very different part of the world. I'm in Maine, which is now about minus 10 degrees centigrade. So there's plenty of snow and ice outside for anybody who wishes. We can put it in a little care package and send it your way. And let's get right into this. So why did I write this? I wrote this because we're in an age of extreme polarization and anger, and I'm right and you're wrong if you don't agree with me. And when you're thinking about a society that's so polarized, you got to ask yourself a couple of questions. Is it really true that you're right and everybody else who disagrees with you is wrong? And even if you are completely right, there's an absolutely fundamental question, which is, what if right and wrong changes over time? So maybe you are right today, but what if the notion of right and wrong of ethics itself changes across time? And you can actually see this, right? So if you got a time machine and you went back in time, there was a period in time where human sacrifices were not only legal, but essential for the society. Because if you didn't sacrifice this poor schlub and rip out their heart with an obsidian knife, then maybe the rains wouldn't come, or maybe the sun wouldn't shine. So this wasn't considered a fringe activity. This was considered a fundamental activity that allowed society to continue. And we look at that today and we think, wow, these people were pretty savage. But of course, if you go into the squares of Paris, those beautiful squares in Paris used to be theater where somebody would come out and be beheaded. And not only would they behead the person, they would show off the head, still dripping blood, to everybody else. And everybody would come dressed in their Sunday finest, and it would be a picnic, and you'd bring the children and they'd sell little postcards. And of course, we look at that today and we say these people were pretty savage. So our notions of what's right and what's wrong do change over time. Our notions of what should be legal, our notions of what the state should be doing, our notions of what we should be doing to each other. And what's pretty extraordinary is when you started doing away with human bondage, when you started doing away with serfdom, when you started doing it with slavery, a practice that had been in place everywhere, had been in place in India, in China, in Africa, in the US, in Europe, with the Incas, with the Mayas, with the Finns, with the Swedes, with the Russians. That practice went away after millennia when you started having the use of energy and of machines. So a single barrel of oil is the equivalent of about 10 years of a person's labor. And when you tie that to thousands of horsepower, then all of a sudden, in a relatively short period of time, almost everywhere in the world, the legality of indenturing human beings goes away. That doesn't mean that we've completely done away with indentured servitude, with serfdom, with slavery. We have not. But it is not considered legal or justifiable or in any way right in any society. And so here's what happened to human life expectancy. All of us human life expectancy, which had been between 20 and 30 years for tens of thousands of years, suddenly exploded, and it exploded across all places, including Africa. As technology allowed us to treat each other better, as technology provided labor, then we could afford to be more generous to other human beings. That does not justify in any way, shape, or form taking another person's life or indenturing a person to servitude. There is no circumstance under which that is ethical. However, it was practiced for hundreds of thousands of years across cultures and across civilizations. So the main point of this thing is that technology changes ethics. Technology changes our notion of what's right and wrong. And we're in a period of exponentially changing technology. And therefore, our notions of what's right and wrong may start to change. So take a subject which was pretty clear to me and is pretty taught in a very specific fashion, which is, should two people of the same sex be allowed to marry? I was brought up in Mexico. I was brought up in a Catholic school. And the preachers, the teachers, my parents, my peers, the government, the newspapers, everybody told me, this is a horrendous thing and you should not do it. And there are still many societies in the world where that is taught. And in fact, the United States, in 1997, 2/3 of the United States was against gay marriage. Now, fast forward that a couple of decades, and all of a sudden 2/3 of the United States has flipped and is in favor of civil rights for same sex. So here's a subject which many of us were taught as children one way, that has flipped 180 degrees for many of us as we've learned more about gay culture, about human rights, about biology. And this happens even to people like the Pope. So the Pope spends all day, every day, thinking about morality. And in 2010, as Cardinal, he said, you know, same-sex rights are a destructive attempt towards God's plan. And by 2013, as Pope, he says, who am I to judge? And last year, against a lot of his top prelates and against a large part of his flock, he came out in favor of same-sex civil rights. So this is something that can flip 180 degrees, even in people who think all day, or are supposed to think all day, only holy thoughts. The point of this whole thing is that you may be doing a lot of things today, or you may accept a lot of things today that may be fundamentally wrong tomorrow, that may be considered just anathema. And again, it's technology that may change this. So a synthetic burger that you'd eat at Burger King or McDonald's or someplace, well, that little burger cost $380,000 in 2013. It cost $30 in 2015. It cost $9 in 2020. So as the price comes down on this, as you get faster, better, cheaper meat, a lot of people are going to say, why am I keeping 6 billion animals and killing them? What is the purpose of having animals in cages for their whole lives and then slaughtering them for meat if I have this alternative? Now, the majority of people today are not vegans. They're not vegetarians. There are certainly many who are, but the majority are not. When you do have synthetic meat, then the majority will probably become virtually vegan, or virtually not vegan, but vegetarian. And as this stuff flips, then pictures of going into a fancy steakhouse where the display rack in the fancy steakhouse is rotting pieces of meat are going to be seen in a very different context by our grandkids. And it's going to be very hard for them to believe that grandpa and grandma would ever walk into a place and feel hungry seeing these things in the entrance, which is something that, of course, we think is a very fancy steakhouse. Taking your time machine again, think about having a conversation with your grandparents about sex, about the birds and the bees. So what would happen if you could bring them back in a time machine as randy 21-year-olds? Well, when you explain sex to your grandpa and grandma, the first thing you have to explain is, hey, you can now have sex and not have a child. And that would be very weird to them, because for tens of thousands of years, for hundreds of thousands of years, sex usually equaled baby. There was primitive birth control, but it wasn't terribly effective. And now what you've done is you've decoupled the act from the consequence. Then you talk about in vitro fertilization. And you explain to your grandpa and grandma that two bodies never have to touch each other. They don't have to be in the same room. They don't have to be in the same country to be able to conceive a child. And again, they'd look at you and they'd say, so what you're telling me is that the Immaculate Conception isn't just a miracle, it's something that you're performing every day? Think about how weird this would seem to them. Then there's the matter of surrogate mothers. So you can have a child that is conceived without two people touching each other, that is carried to term by a surrogate mother. And because you can freeze those fertilized eggs, that in essence means that you can have identical twins born a decade apart, 2 decades apart, 3 decades apart. So you've decoupled sex from consequence, you've decoupled sex from physical contact, and you've decoupled sex from time. And again, if you asked your grandparents back when they were 21, do you think this is right? They would have said this is the devil's work. But today, of course, it is just something that we take naturally and discuss. Should I do this with a friend over a coffee? Fast forward that now. Imagine that you are now a 21-year-old brought back in 100 years by your grandkids. And your grandkids are now explaining to you what happened to sex and what they consider right and wrong. So right now, we consider editing babies a scandal. But it's perfectly possible that they'll say, Grandpa, Grandma, can you explain to me why you were so primitive that you didn't edit my genes when I was conceived? Because I now have cancer because you left in a BRCA gene, you left in a P53, you left in a KRAS. It is absolutely insane that because of your primitive superstitions, you did not edit my genome, and therefore I am sick today. And again, the logic can flip 180 degrees. Or you're beginning to have artificial uterus. So you can now bring animals to term outside an animal's body. And again, we look at this and this looks pretty awful, but to them, it may be completely natural. So Grandma, Grandpa, is it really true that you took me on that crazy trip to that dangerous place instead of leaving me inside a nice lab protected? And when you got stomach flu or you got typhoid, I was inside your body? Or is it true that you used to take me mountain biking instead of leaving me in a nice protected lab? And so the logic of this can change 180 degrees. And in the same way as today, we accept cesareans as a normal procedure for childbirth. Other procedures may be different in one generation or two. When you take the position, I know right, and you are wrong, and there is going to be no discussion about this because either you agree with me or you don't, then there's no space for discussion, no space for tolerance, no space for the evolution of thought, and there's certainly no space for learning. And in today's highly polarized environment where you can't use a certain word or you are crucified for having used a word 10 years ago whose meaning may have changed, or for doing something whose meaning may be very different in today's terms, then you get a very polarized, angry society that spends most of its time fighting other people. So what's the bottom line on this? Technology is exponential. Technology changes ethics, and ethics may start changing at exponential rates. And so as you're thinking about this stuff, there's technologies, for instance, that I've been working on for a couple of decades now, like being able to program synthetic life. So what you're looking at here is the first time that humans have taken the entire gene code out of something that's living, inserted a completely new gene code, and created a different species. And we can now do this, and in fact, we can start printing life forms on demand in what starts to look like desktop printers. So as we're going forward in this stuff, we're going to start seeing some very strange stuff. There are people building like biohybrid animals using rat heart cells, rubber, and gold. You may start seeing different kinds of creatures or plants to live in extreme environments like Mars or the moon. This man, Jack Szostak, is trying to recreate life from scratch and take chemicals that existed a billion years ago and assemble them into something that spontaneously becomes a living creature. We may see the results of that in the next decade. And again, if you can create life from scratch, if you can do it with common chemicals, the implication is life probably originated several times, and it is probably common in the universe. So there are a lot of implications to this stuff. As we think about ethics, as we judge each other, as we talk to each other, if you assume that even you can be wrong, you have to bring back two words that are rarely used today, which are humility and forgiveness. You have to be humble towards other and forgiving towards other and towards yourself. You have to look at what people did in the context of what they were taught and their times. And one advantage of doing this is, if not everybody on the other side is awful, a baby killer, a pedophile, a this, a that, or the other, then you can truly isolate the 1 or 2% who are truly evil. Because there are 1 or 2% who are truly evil. And the problem when you tar the entire other side and say all of them are the same, it becomes very hard to cull from the herd the people who are the psychopaths, the people who are the sadists, the people who are corrupt. Because they have this umbrella of saying, see, they're blaming all of us. We're all the same. No, you're not all the same. I may disagree with you, but you are probably a decent person who wants to be respected by their peers, who wants to be a good father or mother, who wants to be a good son or daughter. You may have beliefs that are very different from mine, but your basic humanity and thought of what you want to do on this earth is very different from somebody who is an absolutely corrupt leader or somebody who is a very destructive leader. And that's why it's so important to separate evil from differences of opinion. This is especially important in today's world because all of us have been electronically tattooed. So if you think that we can judge figures in history because X or Y or Z did the wrong thing, or did X, or had this opinion, or wrote this, or treated somebody else in this way, well, guess what? Your Google records, your Facebook, your Twitter, your Instagram, your credit card spending patterns, your dating profiles, your pictures, your friends' tags, your PayPal, they're all electronic tattoos that are going to tell people exactly what you did, exactly with whom, And if the rules change, something you do today may look really wrong tomorrow. So it's on our own interest to begin to practice humility and forgiveness. And that's why it's so important in today's debate on right and wrong to understand that these rules can change, that our notions of right and wrong can change, that we have to listen to one another and talk to one another because we may be coming from very different places.